Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about a 38-year period of time, starting with the War of 1812, ending with the Compromise of 1850. When the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1787, the colonies then became states, and our country began to come together and to take on a life of its own. Of course, part of that is people beginning to move. The freedom to move has always been an American ideal. As American citizens began to move west out of the 13 original colonies and into territories on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, it became obvious that they were coming in contact with British outposts, and that began to cause some frictions. And then, of course, there were some other frictions that led to the War of 1812. And we're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on the War of 1812, but it is an interesting period of time. Of course, the British reinvaded the United States of America. And many Americans forget that the British actually made it all the way to Washington, D.C., captured Washington, D.C., and burned the White House to the ground. It was during the War of 1812 that Francis Scott Key wrote our national anthem as he sat as a prisoner of the British on a ship in the Chesapeake Bay, as he was a first-hand witness as the British assaulted Fort McHenry that was guarding Baltimore, Maryland. And of course, the American Fort McHenry withstood the blasts and the invasion of the British Navy, and the Stars and Stripes flew throughout the night, and that is how he knew that American forces had won the day. And of course, that is why he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. The War of 1812 ended at the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, with a United States victory led by the great General Andrew Jackson. Of course, Andrew Jackson will leverage his fame as the victor of the Battle of New Orleans and the victor of the War of 1812 into a fantastic, very memorable political career, ending as the United States President in the future. The victory that Jackson secured at the Battle of New Orleans secured U.S. interests and, of course, pushed Great Britain pretty much back out of American territories and up into Canada. With the War of 1812 over, more Western expansion increased. And as people moved and formed into areas called territories, those territories eventually wanted to become states. Because as territories, they were not allowed to have Congress people in the House of Representatives. They were not allowed to have senators. They were not allowed to have state legislatures or even governors. They had territorial governors and territorial legislatures, but they didn't have representation in Washington, D.C. So territories want to become states. And as they begin seeking statehood, then that raised another issue. And that issue, of course, is slavery. The slavery issue had been part of the American scene since as early as the 1610, when many of the very first slaves started to come into the original colonies in Virginia. And the slavery issue had never really been dealt with. At the time of 1820, a very unique situation was in play in the federal government. At the time of 1820, there were 11 free states, mostly in the north, and 11 slave states, mostly in the south. And of course, as we know from the Constitution, each state is allowed to have 2 senators. So as of right now, in the year 1820, there are 44 senators, 22 senators from the northern states who want to get rid of slavery and want America to have freedom for everyone, and of course 22 senators from your slave states. And so legislation and passing laws one way or either way was impossible coming out of a tied Senate. And so as territories then began seeking statehood, as you admit states into the Union, you can create an issue. It could be what I have written here, create an imbalance in the Senate. If you create a couple of states in the South, now the southern states would have control of the Senate and no legislation would take place. If you created 2 states in the North, then your free states would have more credibility and more power to create legislation that would affect the southern states. And so we are in an impasse right here. Southern states very much clinging to the 10th Amendment, which states that if, in the Constitution, if rights or powers are not granted to the federal government, they automatically go to the states. And of course the southern states were saying slavery, all right, you guys don't like slavery in the north, that's entirely up to you. You leave us alone. You can't dictate to us in the South. These southern states, that was their rationale. This is a states' rights issue. If our state wants to keep slavery legal, that's our business. That's not the federal government's business. Now, in 1804, the importation of new slaves from Africa had been passed as a law outlawing it. So most of the slaves that we're talking about now are second to third generation born here in America. But they were still in servitude and slavery in the southern states, and the nation is trying to grapple with this issue. We have two territories that are seeking statehood. And so a compromise was worked out by the great statesman Henry Clay of Kentucky. Henry Clay had a very distinguished career early in the 19th century government of the United States. He was a member of the House of Representatives for Kentucky. He was also a senator from Kentucky, and he also served as the 9th Secretary of State for the United States. So a very distinguished politician. He then authors what is now known as the Missouri Compromise. And under this compromise, Missouri would be admitted into the Union as a slave state. To keep this balance, and in effect kick the can down the road, but to keep this balance for another and to deal with it at another day, Maine was carved out of the New England area of Massachusetts, and was carved out and created the state of Maine, and it was admitted as a free state. Here again, one coming in as a slave state, one coming in as a free state, keeping that balance of power in the United States Senate. It did mention, and come to be agreed upon, that any future states from the area of the Louisiana Purchase north of 36 degrees latitude and 30 minutes latitude will automatically be free states. Now, give you a quick explanation of what these numbers mean. In geography, we measure distances on Mother Earth through latitude and longitude. In this case, it's not an issue of east and west, it's an issue of north and south. And so latitude is the issue. When we talk about degrees of latitude, 1 degree of latitude equals 60 nautical miles, or also referred to as knots. And you generally use knots or nautical miles when you're up in a plane for airspeed, or you're out on open water in the ocean. Ships generally count their speed, all right, as knots. A minute, which comes as a wedge-shaped mark, equals 1 nautical mile. So if we come to our map here, you can see here in the United States, off the side here, the latitudes, 20 degrees north, 25 degrees north, 30 degrees north, 35 degrees north, all right? And as you can see, it mentioned it 36 degrees north. So if you came right up here to 36 degrees north and you ran your line across, that would take you right on the southern edge of Missouri. All right, and then of course along the border of Kansas and Oklahoma, Colorado and New Mexico, Utah and Arizona. So any further territories north of there in the Louisiana Purchase would come in as free states. Now, 35 degrees north of the equator. The equator would be 0 degrees latitude. That bought the United States about 30 years. Prosperity kept going, people kept moving, and California then becomes the center of attention because gold is found in California. And mass migrations of people trying to get to California to strike it rich in the gold fields. California then had so many people living there that it applied for statehood. And that brings us to another issue. And so another compromise had to be drawn up to try and create this balance. It is known as the Compromise of 1850. 3 gentlemen are the authors of it. We've already mentioned Henry Clay, the great compromiser from Kentucky. John C. Calhoun, a very prominent senator from South Carolina. And Daniel Webster, an extreme abolitionist who hated slavery and wanted to get rid of slavery as an institution from Massachusetts. But these three men kind of sat down and worked with other politicians and came up with the Compromise of 1850. We mentioned the term compromise, but the southern states, when all was said and done, were very suspicious of the Compromise of 1850 and were not satisfied. And it will be 10 short years from the Compromise of 1850 that the United States Civil War commences, because the Compromise of 1850 was not able to do what these politicians wanted. John C. Calhoun was part of the authorship, but he eventually turned against the Compromise of 1850 and voted against it. But the three main elements, there were actually 5 elements, but we're only going to focus on 3 today. The 3 main elements, California would be admitted into the United States as a free state. And that was a big one because California was a large state carved out of territory that was taken from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. And it was a very big prize. And for California to come in as a free state began to tip the balance of power in the U.S. Senate towards abolitionist free states. It allowed territories of New Mexico and Utah to choose. By now, Mormon pioneers have moved into Utah and created a territory. These were not states. Matter of fact, New Mexico and Utah will not become states for 50 to 60 years later. But they were territories by now, and they could choose. Interestingly enough, Utah chose that slavery would not really be an issue, but that slavery, they didn't really take a firm position, but if there is documentation that there were some slaves in the territory of Utah. And a southern demand was that a new law be passed, because by the 1850s, slaves were figuring out that if they could get to the northern states, that then they could have their freedom. So to make this Compromise of 1850 work, your slave states in the South wanted a law passed saying that people, if they found slaves, that they were legally bound to return those slaves back to slavery in the southern states. It became known as the Fugitive Slave Act. So we're setting the stage here for the growth of a nation and trying to grapple with this very moral issue of slavery. And you can see that bright minds tried to figure it out. In the end, when it comes to moral issues, and this is something that we need to learn from history, you cannot politicize and do away with moral issues through politics. It has to come through the heart and mind of people, and there's really no way to do it through politics and law. Some things are simply moral, and some things are simply immoral. And you can tell that they're trying to figure out a way to deal with the slave issue. In the end, it will take a war, a civil war, and hundreds of thousands of young men and shedding their blood to do away with slavery once and for all. But this does set the stage from the War of 1812 to the Compromise of 1850, a period of rapid growth in the young United States. And as they grow and develop and mature into a nation, how do they deal with this moral issue of slavery in the United States? The Compromise of Missouri Compromise, authored by Henry Clay, and the Compromise of 1850 are two of the more famous ones. And as we've mentioned, they really just kick the can down the road, and eventually in 1860 shots will be fired and the Civil War will commence. And the byproduct of the Civil War is the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment guaranteeing rights to former slaves and doing away with slavery once and for all in the United States of America. Thank you for joining me here on my YouTube channel, and as always, when you're around people, wear your mask and socially distance.